For centuries, the Roman Republic was not just a political structure. It was a balance. Power was not concentrated in a single individual. It was distributed across institutions, consuls, the Senate, assemblies, each designed to limit the others. No one could dominate the system completely. At least, that was the intention. This structure created stability. Decisions were debated. Authority was shared. Leadership changed regularly. And for generations, this balance allowed Rome to expand, to manage conflict, and to integrate new territories without collapsing under its own weight. From the outside, it appeared resilient. From the inside, it appeared controlled. But systems that rely on balance require constant maintenance. Because balance is not permanent. It is sustained. And when pressures increase, the effort required to maintain it increases as well. By the late Republic, those pressures were everywhere. Territory had expanded beyond what the original system was designed to manage. Generals were commanding armies far from Rome, building loyalty not just to the state, but to themselves. Wealth was concentrating in fewer hands. Political competition intensified. None of these changes were sudden. They developed gradually, and that gradual nature made them difficult to recognize as threats, because each change on its own could be explained, managed, justified, but together they altered the system. Still, the structure remained. The Senate continued to meet. Consuls continued to be elected. The forms of the Republic stayed in place. And as long as the forms remained, many believed the system itself remained intact. This belief mattered, because it delayed response. It created the impression that adaptation was not urgent, that the system could absorb the pressure, that it had always done so before. But the conditions were no longer the same. The scale had changed. The incentives had changed. And the individuals operating within the system were beginning to act differently. Not in ways that immediately broke the structure, but in ways that slowly moved beyond it. At first, nothing seemed broken. The Roman Republic still operated. Laws were passed. Officials were elected. The Senate continued to debate. From the outside, and even to many within, it appeared that the system was functioning as it always had. But functionality can be misleading, because systems do not fail only when they stop working. They fail when they begin to work differently. One of the earliest and most significant shifts came through individuals who operated at the edges of the system. Generals, men who commanded armies not just in Rome, but across distant territories. These commanders spent years away from the center, leading troops through campaigns that required autonomy. Over time, something changed in that relationship. Loyalty shifted, not entirely, but enough. Soldiers who fought under the same leader for years began to see that leader as more than a representative of the state. He became a source of reward, protection, and opportunity. Victories brought wealth. Wealth brought influence. And influence, when concentrated, begins to alter how power is perceived. This was not illegal, not at first, but it was significant, because the Republic had been designed around a different assumption, that authority was temporary, that no individual would hold power long enough to reshape the system around themselves. That assumption was beginning to fail. At the same time, political competition within Rome intensified. Positions were no longer stepping stones. They became objectives. The pursuit of office shifted from service to strategy. Alliances formed not around policy, but around advantage. Decisions were influenced not just by what benefited the state, but by what secured position. Again, none of this was immediate. It did not happen in a single moment. It happened in patterns, repeated behaviors that, over time, created a new normal. And because each step was small, it did not trigger a response. No single action seemed large enough to require structural change. So nothing was changed. The system adapted. But adaptation without direction leads to drift. And drift, when unrecognized, leads to loss of control. There were attempts to correct the course. Reforms proposed. Limits suggested. Warnings raised. But they were inconsistent, partial, and often opposed by those who benefited from the changes already underway. The result was not collapse. It was continuation, a system moving forward, still functioning, but no longer aligned with its original structure. And because it continued to function, it continued to be trusted. The shift was no longer subtle. What had begun as gradual change inside the Roman Republic was now visible in the actions of individuals who no longer operated within its limits. The system still existed, but it was no longer defining behavior. Behavior was defining the system. At the center of this transformation stood figures who understood how to use the Republic without being constrained by it. Among them was Julius Caesar, a commander whose success in distant campaigns translated into something far more significant than victory. It created influence, not just in the Senate, but in the army. And the army, by this stage, was no longer a neutral instrument of the state. It was a force shaped by loyalty, expectation, and reward. Soldiers who had fought under Caesar did not see him as a temporary official. They saw him as a leader who had delivered results, wealth, stability, and success. This distinction changed everything, because once a military force aligns more closely with an individual than with a system, the balance that defines that system begins to break. Caesar's return to Rome was not just a political event. It was a test. Would the Republic assert its authority, or would it adapt again? The crossing of the Rubicon was not a large-scale battle. It was a decision, a deliberate act that moved beyond the established limits of the Republic. By leading his army into Italy, Caesar forced the system to respond. But response requires unity, and unity no longer existed. Political factions were divided. Some supported him, others opposed him. Many hesitated, unsure of how far the situation would escalate. This hesitation mattered, because in moments of structural stress, delay benefits those who are willing to act. Civil war followed, not as an unexpected outcome, but as a consequence of accumulated imbalance. The Republic fought itself, and in doing so, it revealed something fundamental. The structures that once maintained order were no longer strong enough to contain conflict. Victory in that conflict did not restore balance. It concentrated power. Caesar emerged not just as a successful general, but as a central figure whose authority extended beyond traditional limits. Titles changed. Roles expanded. The distinction between republic and individual leadership blurred. But the forms remained. The Senate still met. Offices still existed. From the outside, the system appeared intact. But internally, it had already changed. By the time the shift became undeniable, the options were limited. Within the Roman Republic, there were still those who believed the system could be restored, that the balance between institutions could be re-established, that the concentration of power in a single individual could be reversed before it became permanent. At the center of that belief was a decision, not gradual, not indirect, but immediate. If the individual represented the break in the system, then removing that individual could restore it. That individual was Julius Caesar. The plan was built on a familiar assumption, that the Republic still had the capacity to return to its previous state, that the removal of one figure would allow the system to reset. But the conditions had already changed. Power had already shifted. Loyalties had already been redefined. The system they were trying to restore was no longer the system that existed. Still, the decision was made. The assassination took place inside the Senate, symbolically significant, intentionally visible, designed to represent the authority of the Republic acting against what it defined as a threat. From a structural perspective, it was a direct attempt to reclaim control. But systems do not respond only to actions. They respond to conditions. And the conditions had already moved beyond what a single action could resolve. The immediate result was not restoration. It was instability, because the removal of Caesar did not remove the factors that had elevated him. The military loyalties, the political divisions, the concentration of influence, none of these disappeared. Instead, they intensified. New figures emerged. New alliances formed. And the conflict that followed was not about whether the Republic would continue. It was about who would control what came next. The removal of Julius Caesar was supposed to restore the Roman Republic. Instead, it revealed that the Republic no longer existed in the way its defenders believed. The system had already changed. What followed was not a return to balance, but a continuation of instability. The factions that had opposed Caesar did not unite. They divided. The alliances that formed after his death were not built on restoring the Republic, but on controlling the outcome of what came next. Figures who had once operated within the system now operated above it. Military power remained central. Loyalty remained personal, and the same conditions that had allowed Caesar to rise still existed. They had not been removed. They had been redistributed. The conflict that followed was not smaller. It was larger, because it no longer revolved around a single individual. It involved multiple leaders, each with their own support, their own armies, their own vision of control. The system that had once limited power was no longer capable of doing so. The Republic had not collapsed in a single moment. It had been replaced. Gradually, then suddenly. From the outside, elements of the old structure remained. The Senate continued to function. Titles were preserved. The language of the Republic was still used, but the reality was different, because the defining feature of the Republic, shared power, was gone. In its place, a new structure emerged, not immediately named, not immediately defined, but clearly different. Authority became centralized, decisions became concentrated, and over time, this transformation reached its final form under Augustus. He did not present himself as a king. He did not openly declare the end of the Republic. He maintained its appearance, but he controlled its function, and that distinction mattered, because it allowed the system to change without appearing to break. The Republic, in form, survived, but in reality it had become something else, an empire. The people who had ignored the early signs, the gradual shifts, the small changes, the redefinition of power, did not expect this outcome. They expected correction. They expected restoration. What they got instead was transformation.